David Clendon.
Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to stand to take a short call on this bill. My pleasure is only slightly spoiled by the fact that some members who as recently as last night were bellowing that the Greens always oppose everything are not here to see our agreeable sides here. The Greens are naturally agreeable people. We will always support well thought out legislation that does some good, does no harm and achieves its goals. And on that basis we're very happy to support this piece of legislation we're debating today. So the bill before us has a fairly straightforward objective, but an important one, to harmonise and to allow a degree of cooperation, a higher degree of cooperation between regulators in New Zealand and elsewhere, equivalent regulators to our Commerce Commission, particularly in Australia, of course, one of our key trading partners. It ought to be reasonably easily achieved given the similarities in the two countries' culture and practice. Not to say it will be very simple, but clearly it's an appropriate ambition to enable that regulation of the wider market, the Australia-New Zealand market initially. So we know very well that in the absence of regulation, markets fail. We're still suffering consequences internationally as well as in New Zealand of the aspects of an unregulated, inadequately regulated markets that inevitably lead to enormous economic, social and environmental cost. So to the extent that this bill endeavours to get common approaches to regulation, to enable regulators to communicate and cooperate with each other, that is a good thing, and it's likely to enhance the potential for genuinely fair trade within and between countries. So there was one issue that came up in the course of submissions to this bill, which now seemed a very long time ago. With the benefit of 2020 hindsight, it's apparent perhaps that to include telecoms regulators within this bill would have been a good thing. And the Commerce Commission themselves made a fairly robust submission encouraging the inclusion of telecoms regulators. It was deemed, I'm sure correctly by the committee, that to expand the bill, the scope of the bill to include those regulators was not possible or appropriate, and that's a reasonable decision, but I just flag that as perhaps a work for another time. So the Select Committee has come back with recommendations that the bill be amended to allow regulator to regulator as well as government to government arrangements and cooperation arrangements subject to ministerial approval. And that would seem to be a sensible approach. The examples given of the difficulty otherwise of having to establish relationships not only with the Australian federal government but the state governments as well. It has the added advantage of ensuring that the regulators can speak to one another independently of government engagement or involvement where that might be appropriate, and we think it may well be. I think the committee's willingness to support and indeed recommend the regulator-to-regulator relationships being built assumes a level of comfort around the independence of the organisations with whom our Commerce Commission could engage, both their independence and indeed their trustworthiness, their reliability. And I believe that's appropriate. But I also think that given that these relationships will to some extent be built on a degree of trust, that it's incumbent on our regulators and indeed on our government to lightly monitor the evolution and development of those organisations with whom we do develop regulator relationships as opposed to government ones, just to ensure that the level of trust that's implied in this recommendation is sustained over time. And that's not a suggestion, I'm not implying that there's any immediate harm or likelihood of a reason to lose that trust, but I do think it's something incumbent on us and our regulators to maintain some alertness to that possibility. So the Greens, our only initial concern about this bill in its original draft was the implication that some organisations, some entities could be exempted from the necessity of paying fees. So we looked into that and the conversation went through the committee clearly, and it became apparent that the target for that, the intended recipients of that goodwill, the exemption of the fees, were the SMEs, the small and medium enterprise sector. And with that reassurance, we're entirely happy to support that. I think it's fair to say we know that the SMEs are a major contributor to our economy. Something like 40% of the value-added economic activity in our economy is through the SMEs. They are arguably an inadequately acknowledged and respected sector, part of our economy, and I think it's good that they are been given this consideration in the bill to remove them from the reliability of fees, which are actually scaled more appropriately for large corporate entities who can carry that cost structure and that cost burden. So, Sarah, I think that's as much as I need to say on this bill. It's been fairly well covered by other speakers. We do support it. We think it's good legislation, and we're pleased to see it progress through this House. Kia ora koutou.
The Honourable Nick Smith.